Moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to escape the relentless hum of city life and settle into something more peaceful, more predictable. I wanted to wake up to the sound of birds, not car horns, to feel the warmth of the sun on my face instead of the fluorescent glow of office lights. The houses here were nearly identical, neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted porches, a lingering scent of cut grass in the air, but something about my new home felt off. I couldn't place it at first, just a subtle wrongness I pushed to the back of my mind. It wasn't until I noticed my neighbor, the old man next door, that the unease settled in my bones like a sickness. Every night, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, he would step into his backyard with a shovel in hand, moving with slow, deliberate purpose. At first, I assumed he was gardening, maybe tending to a stubborn patch of earth, but as the days passed, the hole grew deeper. Too deep. Too wide. And yet, he never seemed to fill it in. I watched from my bedroom window, unable to shake the feeling that I was witnessing something I was never meant to see. He never worked during the day, never spoke to anyone, never acknowledged the people who passed by his house. Just digging. Always digging. The motion was almost hypnotic, his arms moving in steady rhythm, the dirt piling up beside him like a burial mound. One night, unable to resist my curiosity, I leaned closer to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. That's when he stopped. His body froze mid-motion, as if he could feel my gaze piercing through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as he slowly turned his head, his sunken eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down my spine. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stared, his face expressionless, his fingers tightening around the wooden handle of the shovel. Then, without warning, he grinned, a wide, unnatural stretch of his lips that made my stomach twist with nausea. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest, the image of that grotesque grin burned into my mind like a brand. For the first time since I moved in, I locked my windows, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, trying to shake the unsettling sensation crawling up my spine. But even through the thick fabric, I could still feel it, that presence, that silent knowing. He had seen me watching. He knew I was there. And somehow, in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. I told myself I wouldn't look again. I told myself that whatever was happening next door wasn't my problem, that old men did strange things, that maybe Langley had lived long enough to earn his quirks. But that grin, God, that unnatural, stretched too wide grin, had carved itself into my mind like a sickness, gnawing at me long after I had closed my curtains. I barely slept that night, twisting and turning in my bed, heart leaping at every sound, every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the windowpane. The moment my alarm went off, I sprang up, my body drenched in sweat, my pulse hammering in my skull like I had just woken from a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. I tried to push the thought of him away, but as I stood in my kitchen, sipping my morning coffee, I found myself drifting toward the window again, the pull of curiosity stronger than my fear. And that's when I saw it, the hole had grown even larger overnight. It made no sense. I had watched him for hours, had seen him pause when he noticed me staring, yet somehow, the dirt pile had doubled in size, the earth now stretched open like a gaping wound in the middle of his yard. He wasn't digging a simple hole anymore. This was something else. Something deeper. Something deliberate. My stomach twisted at the sight of it, an unease curling up my spine as I stepped away from the window, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to get out, to clear my head, to remind myself that the world outside Langley's backyard still existed. So I did what any rational person would do, I went to the only place where secrets never lasted long. The local diner. Small towns thrived on gossip, and if there was something to know about my strange neighbor, someone there would spill it. But when I asked about him, when I brought up the digging, the hole, the long nights of laboring in the dirt, I was met with nothing but blank stares and awkward silence. The old waitress behind the counter simply refilled my coffee, her lips pressed into a thin line as she muttered, "Langley's been here forever, best not to bother him. Another man, one of those older types who spent his mornings nursing black coffee and reading newspapers like it was still 1992, chuckled dryly and shook his head. "He's always digging," he said, flipping a page without looking at me. "Ain't never seen him stop. The worst part? None of them seemed to care." It wasn't the kind of dismissive ignorance that came from a lack of interest, it was something else. Something rehearsed. Something that made my skin crawl. It was as if they all knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to know. And in that moment, as I stirred my coffee with a shaking hand, I realized something that made my blood turn cold. They weren't just ignoring Langley. They were pretending he wasn't even real. That night, sleep was impossible. No matter how many times I turned over, no matter how many deep breaths I took, there was no shutting out the uneasy sensation slithering beneath my skin like an infection. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again, those blank, dismissive faces at the diner, the way they had so easily brushed off my questions, the way their expressions had seemed almost rehearsed. It wasn't normal. None of it was normal. And yet, as I lay there, wrapped in the suffocating silence of my bedroom, something else gnawed at me, something far worse than the town's eerie indifference. Why was Langley still digging if the hole had disappeared? My brain kept circling back to that impossible fact, the image of his yard, perfectly restored, like it had never been disturbed at all. The dirt, the grass, everything was untouched. But I had seen him the night before, seen the way his body strained with the weight of the shovel, seen the mounds of dirt piling up beside him. So where had the hole gone? And more importantly, what had he buried? The thought lodged itself in my brain like a parasite, growing more unbearable with each passing hour, until finally, around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. The sound was so abrupt, so sharp in the stillness of my room, that my entire body jerked upright before my mind had even processed what was happening. Heart hammering, I reached for the device with shaking fingers, my pulse stuttering as I stared at the screen. Unknown number. The message itself was short. Just 3 words, typed in a cold, unfeeling font. Stop watching him. A chill crawled up my spine, my breath catching in my throat. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably just a prank, some kind of sick joke from a bored teenager, but the deeper, more instinctual part of me knew better. This was a warning. A threat. And yet, despite the ice settling in my veins, despite the overwhelming urge to turn off my phone and pretend I had never seen the message, I found myself doing the exact opposite. My fingers trembled as I typed out a reply, my chest tight with fear. Who is this? No response. I stared at the screen, waiting, willing the sender to reveal themselves, to give me something, anything, to explain the suffocating dread tightening around my ribs. But the only answer I got was silence. Silence, and the faint creak of my bedroom window shifting in its frame, as if someone, or something, was standing outside, just beyond the glass. I didn't look. I couldn't look. Instead, I clutched my phone in a death grip, my breath coming in shallow gasps, as the realization settled over me with bone-deep certainty. I wasn't the one watching Langley anymore. He was watching me. The knocking started just after sunset. Not loud. Not urgent. Just a soft, deliberate tapping against the wood, slow and patient, as if whoever stood on the other side had all the time in the world. I froze mid-step, my entire body tensing as the sound echoed through the quiet of my house. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home, to turn off the lights and let whoever it was think I had gone to bed early. But deep down, I already knew who it was. Langley. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, my breath shallow and unsteady. Then, with a trembling hand, I reached for the peephole, pressing my eye to the cold glass. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. He was smiling. The same unnatural grin, lips stretched too wide, eyes glinting with something too eager, too knowing. And his hands, God, his hands, were covered in dirt. The fabric of his sleeves was stained dark, his fingernails packed with soil, as if he had just crawled out of the very ground itself. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears as I slowly pulled back from the peephole. The knocking had stopped. And then, his voice. Low. Smooth. Like the whisper of something ancient, something that had been waiting far too long. It's almost big enough for two. I took a step back, heart slamming against my ribs, a sharp spike of nausea twisting through my gut. He knew. He knew I had been watching. He knew I had seen too much. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, but somehow, I managed to force out a single, shaking response. I don't know what you're talking about. A pause. A silence so heavy it pressed against my skin like damp earth, smothering, suffocating. And then, laughter. Soft at first, almost amused, but then it grew, stretching into something jagged, something wrong, a sound that shouldn't have been possible coming from a human throat. The lights flickered, the air in the room thickening, the walls seeming to close in, and then, just like that, it stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Nothing. No footsteps retreating. No shuffling. No door creaking open. Slowly, I reached for the peephole again, pulse pounding so hard it rattled my skull. Langley was gone. But the door? The door was unlocked. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door handle as if it might move on its own. The lock had been turned from the inside. My breath came shallow, every nerve in my body screaming that something was wrong, that someone, or something, had been inside my house without me knowing. My fingers trembled as I reached out, feeling the cool metal beneath my touch, pressing it down ever so slowly, my ears straining for any sound, any movement in the darkness beyond the threshold. But the hallway outside was empty. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a scent that hadn't been there before. My stomach twisted as I stepped forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The neighborhood was silent. Too silent. Not even the distant hum of cars on the highway, not the rustle of leaves in the trees, not the chirping of crickets. Just, nothing. I forced my feet to move, stepping off the porch and making my way toward Langley's backyard. The moon was high, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting in ways they shouldn't. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached the edge of his yard, the hole was gone. My chest tightened as I scanned the perfectly even layer of grass, untouched, undisturbed, as if the earth itself had swallowed its own secret hole. I couldn't move. My mind couldn't wrap itself around the impossibility of it. I had watched him dig, night after night, seen the dirt pile up, seen the hole deepen into something vast, something far too big for a simple gardening project. And now? It was as if it had never existed. A cold chill wrapped around my spine, a growing sense of something unseen lurking beneath the surface. I took a slow step back, forcing myself to breathe, to think. Had I imagined all of it? Had my lack of sleep twisted reality into something unreal? But then my foot hit something hard, something that wasn't grass or dirt. I looked down. A shovel. Rusted, worn, covered in fresh soil. It hadn't been there before. My fingers twitched, my skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes watching me, waiting. And then, in the distance, from within Langley's darkened house, a single light flickered on. And behind the glass, standing perfectly still, was Langley. Smiling. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Langley's face in the window, his grin stretching unnaturally wide, his eyes locked onto mine as if he could see straight through my skin, down into the very marrow of my bones. The worst part wasn't that he had been watching me. It was that I had the gut-wrenching certainty that he wanted me to see him. I double-checked every lock in the house, shoved a chair beneath the front door handle, and turned off all the lights, hoping, praying, that whatever game he was playing would end if I simply stopped reacting. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. The entire house felt wrong, the air thick and stale, as if I were trapped in a place that had been sealed off for years. And then, just past 3 in the morning, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from beneath the floor. It was so soft at first that I thought I had imagined it, some trick of my exhausted mind. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate drag, like something sharp being pulled across the wooden beams beneath my bed. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I forced myself up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to get out, to leave this house and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. The sound came again, this time closer, shifting beneath the floorboards, directly below me. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand with shaking hands and crept toward the basement door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The moment I reached the top of the stairs, the scent hit me, damp soil and rot, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself had begun to decay from the inside. My stomach twisted, my throat tightening as I descended, the wooden steps groaning beneath my weight. The basement was freezing, the concrete floor icy against my bare feet. The dim glow of the flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough. Enough to see the dirt falling from the ceiling. My blood ran cold. The basement ceiling was made of solid wood and concrete. There was no reason, no possible reason, for dirt to be sifting through the cracks, landing in small, uneven piles across the floor. And yet, as I stood there, frozen in place, another clump fell, as if something was shifting, digging, moving above me. And that's when I saw it. Near the far corner of the basement, beneath the dim glow of the flickering light bulb, something had been dug out. A small, jagged opening in the floor. A tunnel. Narrow. Deep. Leading somewhere underneath the house. And before I could even take a step back, the flashlight flickered. And something whispered my name from inside the tunnel. I don't remember how long I stood there, my body locked in place, my breath shallow and uneven as the sound of my own name slithered through the darkness of the tunnel. It wasn't just a whisper. It was my voice. The inflection, the cadence, everything about it was me, except for one thing. It was wrong. It was stretched too thin, too distorted, the syllables bending in ways a human throat wasn't meant to produce. The flashlight in my grip flickered violently, casting erratic shadows along the damp basement walls, making the hole in the floor seem deeper, wider, more alive. My pulse pounded in my ears, my skin crawling with the overwhelming sensation that something was watching me, something just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the tunnel. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. A sharp, jarring buzz that made my entire body flinch. My fingers trembled as I yanked it out, barely able to focus on the screen through my shaking vision. Unknown number. Another message. Check your camera roll. I didn't want to. Every muscle in my body screamed against it, every instinct told me that whatever I was about to see would be something I could never unsee, something that would embed itself into my brain like a parasite, something that would haunt me in the moments before sleep for the rest of my life. And yet, my thumb moved on its own, tapping the screen, pulling up my gallery. The most recent video was from tonight. Timestamped 5 minutes ago. My hands were slick with sweat as I pressed play. The screen flickered, the footage dim and grainy, but I knew immediately where it had been taken. My basement. The camera was angled toward the tunnel, the same one gaping open in front of me. And then, movement. At first, it was subtle. A shifting in the darkness, a silhouette crawling forward on hands and knees, inching toward the camera, toward the viewer. My breath caught in my throat as the figure pulled itself into the dim glow of the basement light. It was me. But it wasn't. The thing that stared into the camera, that smiled, that grinned too wide, stretched too far, teeth too sharp, was not me. It tilted its head slowly, studying the lens with eyes that weren't quite human, and then, in the same warped, distorted voice that had whispered my name, it spoke. You shouldn't be here. The video ended. The screen went black. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the concrete floor with a hollow, echoing sound. Then, from inside the tunnel, I heard myself laugh. I don't remember picking up my phone. I don't remember sprinting up the basement stairs, my legs barely functioning beneath me, the darkness behind me pressing in, thick and suffocating. I only remember the sound. My own voice. Laughing. From the tunnel. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't some audio glitch. Something was down there. And it knew me. The door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled into my living room, my chest rising and falling in frantic, uneven gasps. My hands were trembling so violently that it took me 3 tries to lock the deadbolt. And even then, it didn't feel like enough. I backed away from the door, my ears straining for any sound, my pulse hammering against my ribs. My mind raced through every possible explanation, every rational excuse, but nothing made sense. How did I get that video? Who took it? How was it even possible that there was something crawling out of that tunnel that looked like me, spoke like me, mocked me? My eyes darted to the window, my stomach twisting at the thought of Langley's house. Was this connected to him? Was he the one digging that tunnel? Had he put something there? The thought made my skin crawl, and yet, as I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had to see where that tunnel led. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to leave this house, to never come back. But something deeper, something darker, gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. If I didn't find out the truth, it wouldn't matter if I left. It would follow me. It would never be over. Slowly, my fingers tightened around the flashlight, my throat dry as sandpaper. I took one last breath, one last fleeting moment of hesitation, before stepping forward, toward the basement, toward the tunnel, toward whatever horror was waiting for me beneath the house. The basement was colder now. Too cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made the air feel heavier, thicker, like something unseen was pressing against your skin. The tunnel was waiting, the jagged hole in the earth yawning open, an invitation into the unknown. My breath shuddered as I crouched down, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The dirt walls were damp, the air thick with decay, and the tunnel stretched on far longer than it should have, longer than my property, longer than Langley's yard. It wasn't possible, but somehow, the tunnel kept going. And at the very end of the beam of light, something shifted. Something moved. And then, I heard my own voice again. Why are you following me? I dropped the flashlight. And in the split second before the darkness swallowed everything, I saw it, myself, crawling toward me from the depths of the tunnel, eyes wide, mouth twisted into something that should never have been a smile. I scrambled backward, my breath a ragged gasp, my hands digging into the cold dirt as the tunnel seemed to close in around me. My flashlight had rolled out of reach, its beam flickering wildly as it spun, casting eerie shadows against the damp walls. And in that uneven glow, I saw it, the thing crawling toward me. It had my face, my skin, my hands, but it wasn't me. The way it moved was all wrong, its limbs twisting at unnatural angles, its fingers dragging through the dirt, its joints bending too loosely, too fluidly, as if it were only pretending to be human. The grin on its face, my face, stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that weren't quite right, too sharp, too many. And when it spoke again, the voice that came from its throat was mine, but not mine. Why are you following me? The words were warped, echoing strangely in the cramped tunnel, like multiple voices layered on top of each other, speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. My lungs burned as I forced myself to move, my body sluggish with terror, my limbs barely responding. I could hear it dragging itself closer, the sound of damp earth shifting, of something wet and unnatural slithering beneath its skin. I reached for the flashlight, fingers shaking, nearly knocking it further into the darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs as I clutched it, swinging the beam up, but the tunnel was empty. The thing was gone. My entire body tensed, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. The air in the tunnel felt thicker now, too dense, too heavy, as if something was pressing against me from all sides. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my skull, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. And then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, from the impossible darkness beyond the reach of my light, a voice whispered. Dozens of voices. Hundreds. All speaking at once. You shouldn't have come down here. The sound crawled up my spine, burrowing into my skull, filling my head with an unbearable pressure. My vision blurred. My hands clenched the dirt. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the walls of the tunnel breathing, expanding and contracting like lungs. I tried to turn back, tried to run, but the tunnel had changed. The way I had come was no longer there. The exit was gone. And in that moment, in the dim flickering light of my flashlight, I realized the horrifying truth. The tunnel hadn't been dug. It had been growing. I don't remember running. I don't remember turning. All I know is that one moment, I was trapped in that suffocating, shifting tunnel, and the next, I was moving blindly through the dark, my breath ragged, my heart hammering so violently I thought it would shatter my ribs. My fingers scraped against the damp, pulsing walls, the soil beneath my feet loose and shifting, as if it wanted to drag me down, swallow me whole. The whispers followed me, seeping into my ears, filling my head with 1,000 overlapping voices, each one speaking in my own tone, my own pitch. I didn't understand the words, not at first, not until the voices all merged into one. One single, deafening sentence, repeated over and over in a chilling, rhythmic chant. You were never supposed to leave. The tunnel stretched on impossibly long, longer than it should have, twisting in directions that didn't make sense. I turned a corner and saw a light ahead, faint but unmistakable. My chest tightened. An exit. I didn't care where it led, I only knew I had to reach it before whatever was crawling behind me, whatever was wearing my face, caught up. The light grew brighter, flickering like a dying bulb, illuminating the jagged dirt walls in quick flashes. And then, just before I reached the opening, something grabbed my ankle. I hit the ground hard, my chin slamming against the dirt, the taste of soil filling my mouth. I kicked, thrashed, my hands clawing at the loose earth as something cold, wet, and wrong wrapped around my leg. The fingers digging into my skin weren't just strong, they were familiar. My breath hitched as I twisted, my eyes locking onto the thing that had dragged me down. It was me. Not the thing from before. Not the twisted, grinning figure I had seen on my phone screen. This was me, down to the last detail. My clothes. My hands. My terrified expression. And worst of all, it was screaming. Please. No. Don't leave me. I don't belong down here. My grip loosened. My mind fractured in that moment, my reality splitting apart. Was this the real me? Was I the copy? My head throbbed with an unbearable pressure, memories flickering in my brain like static, my entire existence unraveling in an instant. Who was I? And then, I made a choice. With one final, desperate kick, I freed myself, lunging toward the light. The last thing I saw before I crossed the threshold was the other me, its face twisted in a mask of pure horror, its fingers reaching, its mouth open in a final, wordless plea. Then, everything went dark.